Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AIDS United's webinar, Creating a Transgender-Affirming Organization. My name is Christine Campbell, and I will kind of be your host today. Just want to let everyone know that today's webinar will be recorded. All participants are in listen-only mode. To ask questions, please use the Q&A box in the lower right hand corner of your screen. So first, a little bit about AIDS United. AIDS United's mission is to end the AIDS epidemic in the United States. We seek to fulfill our mission through strategic grant making, capacity building, policy and advocacy, technical assistance, and formative research. To date, we have directly funded more than $104 million to local communities and have leveraged more than $117 million in additional support for programs that include access to care for people living with HIV, capacity building for community-based organizations, HIV prevention, advocacy, syringe access, and more. About a year ago, we had the pleasure of Parallax coming into our organization and doing a training with us on the transgender community, transgender sensitivity. We were so impressed with that. We said we needed to make sure this got out far and wide. It also spurred us to really enhance our transgender services, our transgender capabilities within the organization. To that end, AIDS United hosted a transgender think tank in Detroit earlier, was it earlier this year?
Yes.
Earlier this year. Out of that, the participants developed a consensus statement that will be being released hopefully by early next month. We also have a white paper coming out as a result of that. Part of our efforts have also included us securing funding from Janssen Pharmaceuticals to do a transgender leadership demonstration project where we'll really be focusing on promoting and advancing transgender leadership in communities across the country. So we want to thank Parallax for kicking us in the tail to move in a more detailed way, a way with more depth, with more reality, to actually support the transgender community, to partner with the transgender community in a real way. So we are, like I said, we are really honored to have Parallax Group as a partner, and I'd like to introduce Hayden Mora.
My name is Hayden Mora, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm incredibly excited about the conversation that we're going to have. Parallax is a trans-led strategy and management firm, and we work with organizations, nonprofits, corporations, government agencies on a number of factors, but also in focusing on helping them to do the work with trans cultural and technical competence. And so excited on today of all days to be here having this conversation with folks like you that are really making a decision to play a leadership role in making things better in our communities. And my colleague Catalina Velasquez is here. And
hello, everybody. I'm Catalina Velasquez. I'm an undocumented and unafraid transgender and unashamed and unapologetic beneficiary of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, based on a prosecutorial discretion memo issued in June 2012 under the former President Obama administration. And a very proud Colombiana, Latina in la lucha, and ready to go over this. So, do you want to guide us through the agenda?
We also have Amy Nelson, Ariana Lean, and Achim Howard joining us. Ariana and Achim are trans leaders in the community that do incredible work in Florida and here in Washington, D.C. Amy plays a leadership role at Whitman Walker, which is really one of our models around the country for how to do this work with excellence. She's going to be sharing a little bit about her journey story. We have a lot of wisdom on the call. Let's get right to it. So our goals for this conversation are significant. We are going to walk through some participant guidelines just to help guide our conversation. We're going to review some language and concepts just to help us all be on the same page and be speaking with a shared set of concepts and a shared set of language. We know that people come to this with all different levels of experience, and we really want the call to be accessible to everyone, and we're so glad that you're here. We're going to talk in a bit more detail about the social, legal, and economic context for the trans community, and specifically about the impact of HIV and AIDS on trans communities. We're going to talk a bit about, so the first part of the agenda really lays out the challenges. And then we're going to shift into therefore what? And that's what this call is really about. It's how can we help and support leaders like you that are committed to this work in creating inclusive and affirming spaces in a way that we hope when you walk away from this call, you'll be able to get to work and feel confident. So we're going to start just with the frame, a principle that we think of when we approach this work. We borrow it from the history of the HIV and AIDS movement, the concept of meaningful engagement, and relating that to trans folks. We're going to talk about some organizational best practices and some specific high-impact programs and services focusing on the trans community. We're going to hear from Amy from Whitman Walker, who's going to give us a practical set of lessons learned and experiences and share a little bit about the journey story. And we're going to hear from Ariana Lean, who is a trans leader who leads a trans-focused organization working with folks at HIV and AIDS, who's going to help us understand and have some advice on best practices around working with the trans community. And then we're going to just talk about additional resources and tools. Obviously, this is the beginning of a conversation, and we want to make sure that walking away from it, you have access to even more detailed information than what we go over here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hayden, for that. And so let's just start framing this conversation, and the organizer in me immediately thinks community agreements. And so let's have this participation guidelines that will help us navigate this very dense and oftentimes convoluted topics, because diversity is a challenge, and it's a challenge for all of us. I would like to start by saying that there is no transgender community, there are transgender communities. And there's a reason we have that in plural, because we understand that transgender is an umbrella term. And so I say that because we must come to this work understanding that there's a spectrum of experiences and identities. And that creates oftentimes multiple challenges. So we start adapting our language to be a more pluralistic one. And what do we mean by pluralistic? Well, when we say you guys, when we say womanhood or manhood, we could start pushing ourselves to understand that not everyone falls under those categories, but might have similar experiences. So oftentimes using words like peoplehood or you all are wonderful alternatives that indicate a welcoming space, but will also continue to attract transgender clientele, patients, but also brilliance. So y'all can have some transgender folks joining your staff. In this webinar, we want to make sure that we respect the space as a learning environment. There are multiple approaches to the work. Nobody holds the truth. We all will provide best practices as trans people because we're trans-led and trans-run, but we do not speak for the entire trans community. And so it's important that we respect different schools of thought and ways of approaching gender, sex, and sexuality as constructs. And so we will say it's important to use respectful, and we already addressed pluralistic language, and challenge yourself by choice. The feminist in me always grounds conversations around self-determination and bodily autonomy. And so know what are your limits, and take a break if you need a break. So that goes into practicing self-care. So let's begin. Gender and sexuality. They both play a large role in human development and the way we bond with others. And so what does that mean? That means that gender and sexuality are as part of who we are as any other identity. And oftentimes we only think of sexual and gender minorities to have a gender or a sexuality. We all have a gender and we all have a sexuality. Yet we live in a society where our discussions of sex and gender are often rooted in fear and shame and all sorts of prejudice. And I think it is important to, as we do this work, unpack that because there's nothing to be fearful about being who you are. And ultimately, the goal is to embrace everyone in their entirety in the spaces that we hold for folks to be successful, but also learn and practice self-love as an act of revolution. So things must change because society is still in that transition phase of what does this all really mean? Gender is more than the way we look. It's also about self-image. It's about developing your own identity. It's about challenging societal roles, learning to express yourself, and communicating your wishes and boundaries as a person. But also it's about science, and it's about so many more things. And so when we talk about gender as a function of culture, when we talk about gender as it relates to different ethnic communities, immigrants, we must understand that it's not static and that it shows up differently because it's beautifully diverse like that. So as we begin, let's practice some key terms that are imperative as we're looking to bring tangible and applicable actions to your organization. We could start with gender identity, right? One's internal sense of being male, female, neither of those, both, of another gender or genders. Everyone has a gender identity, including each one of you on this webinar. So for transgender people, our assigned sex at birth and our own internal sense of identity are not the same. A female, a woman, a girl, a male, a man, a boy, a gender-expansive person are also not necessarily linked to each other, but are just 6 common gender identities. And I say this because sex is a construct, and we will dig a little bit more into that in a minute with an infographic. Gender expression and presentation. The physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc. Most transgender people seek to make their gender expression, how we look, right, match our own gender identity, how we feel, and rather than our sex assigned at birth. Because I always say this to my boyfriend's family, we're more than the summation of our body parts, and my womanhood is not attached to God's way of accessorizing me. And so we use this to discuss company equality, non-employment, company employment and non-discrimination protection policies at the organizational HR level. And so this is also to remind us that these are more than concepts. These are completely applicable elements that transcribe into policies that could make it into a welcoming space or actually hinder our ability to serve everyone in our communities. And so gender identity versus gender expression and why both need to be explicitly outlined will be further discussed as we move along in this webinar. Then we have sex assigned at birth, and what that means is trans folks taking control of the narrative and messaging outside of less positive sound bites that indicate that we are born in the wrong body. This is about us reclaiming our pride, us engaging in self-love, understanding that that we're beautiful, that nothing's wrong with us, that we were not born in the wrong body. We're just exactly who we're meant to be, and we're meant to be respected and live with dignity. So sex assigned at birth is the assignment and classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex based on a combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. Yes, there's a lot of science to sexuality and gender identity. It is important that we say sex assigned at birth rather than simply sex because of the vagueness of the word and its place in transphobia and gender discrimination. And so I say that because our doctors, unfortunately, not always practice science. They will look at our genitals and assume a sex, but there was no scientific, evidence of such. They did not look at our genetic makeup. They did not look at the way our brain is operating and the hormones we produce, because people forget that we produce hormones in our brains, and not in our genitals. And so chromosomes are frequently used to determine sex from prenatal karyotyping, although not as often as genitalia. Chromosomes do not determine genitalia. And so this also addresses a huge part of the community that is intersex. We're not XX or XY, right? Millions of people are born in a combination of different chromosomes. Hayden has a question or a comment.
Yeah, and I know that you're going to chat in just a few minutes about sexual orientation, romantic and emotional attachment, and the gender binary. But I just want to pause for a quick second because I know this is a lot of information. And so Catalina has talked to us about gender identity, the way that we feel inside our deeply held sense of self, gender expression, how we show up and present to the world, and then sex assigned at birth, which literally means when you're born and the doctor, picks you up and hands you over, whether they put an F or an M next to your name. It's not something that you have a choice in. It's something that is assigned to you. So these are really important fundamental building blocks, and they're really different than the way most of us, including me as a trans man, was taught to think about these things. And so one of the points that Catalina was making was that all of us have a gender expression. One thing I just want folks to think about on the call, I know we can't do a verbal back and forth, but just think about what are the messages that you received about what it meant to be, quote, a man or a woman when you were growing up. And then think about, has there ever been a moment or a time in which the way in which you showed up in the world didn't match up with those expectations? A friend of mine who is a gay man, he said to me once, one of the things that really helps me understand the way that our struggles are linked is, I might have these rights under the law, but I know that when I walk down the street and someone calls me a name, it's not because of my sexual orientation, it's because of my gender expression. It's because I show up in a way that doesn't match what other folks think I should show up as a man. And so I think most of us have had experiences like that. And so just as we're thinking practically what these concepts mean and how they apply in our lives, that's one of the ways that I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Because every person has defined gender at some point, right? We have seen the suffrage movement and cisgender women in the 21st century using pants. That's a form of gender defiance, right? And that's where this is very applicable to everybody, and why gender justice is not just about trans folks, it's about everyone, and everyone's right to self-express and live authentically in their truth. One last concept before we move from this slide is quality sexuality education. And I say this because oftentimes we operate in social justice spaces that are very fragmented. We need to be unified and work with one another. Gender justice, the LGBTQ liberation movement, the women's rights movement, and the sexual health and reproductive justice movements are very intertwined. So when we talk about quality sexuality education, and we need to talk about quality sexuality education, we're talking about a structured approach to learning about sexuality that is taught by folks and trained, like teachers and trained professionals in the subject area, not just PE folks that specialize in something different, and we're given this as the last recourse to teach with no prior knowledge. There is science, and there are skills to be gained prior to someone taking on this endeavor of enlightening folks with the best knowledge or science or cutting-edge practices around quality sexuality education. This type of curriculum allows people to develop their own values and beliefs surrounding sexual intimacy and sexual identity, and those are key for each of us to live a plentiful life. Moving on, I know we have put a lot of concepts, so I understand if you're a little bit confused. The good thing about this webinar is you could submit questions at any time, and we will continue to review them as we go on, and we have a Q&A portion at the end, so don't hesitate to use those keyboards. So it's okay to be confused. The trans community is very diverse. We have folks of all backgrounds and of all identities. We have gender expansive, gender queer, gender nonconforming, transgender women, transgender men. I invite folks to, take a deep dive into each of those identities. Facebook actually provides a wonderful menu of options for folks to know and start researching on their own about the different types of gender. But although there are a lot of stereotypes about transgender people, the fact is that the trans communities are as diverse as the world populations. And I say this because as transgender people, we come from all backgrounds, experiences, races, ethnicities, income levels, and religions. This work needs to be intersectional. Diversity is not a luxury, it's mandatory. And so there are trans CEOs, trans celebrities, there's transgender teachers, transgender students, and all sorts of folks working in all areas of life. On a Williams Institute research in 2011, there's an estimate of over 700,000 people in the U.S. that identify as transgender, and the number of people in the United States identifying outside of the gender binary has been exponentially growing, rising from 8% in 2008 to 22% in the last couple of years. And so these posters, as you can see here, are from an awesome campaign done by the DC Office of Human Rights in 2013, and it was the first such campaign in the country, sponsored by a government, local government, and the goal was to reduce violence against trans people by showing that they're a part of the community at large, that we are part of the community at large. And so you may have seen this ads at bus stops here in DC, and if not, I'd invite you to look at that campaign. Moving forward, we have our gender spectrum. And so this will help us visualize what a lot of the concepts that we have touched upon. So when we look at chromosomal sex, it's more than male and female, it's a spectrum, right? And the reason we have these arrows is to exemplify that everything is within a spectrum. And the spectrum that we're working with is still within a very rigid binary, and so I want to address that limitation. But it gives folks who have not been exposed to this topic a better understanding of, all sorts of the world of endless possibilities. And so chromosomal sex is what determines our genitalia. And this is important because, like I said, doctors upon birth don't determine sex based on science. They determine sex based on, stereotyping of body parts. And that's very important because we know that during fetal stages, we could be exposed to high levels of estrogen, high levels of testosterone after our genitalia has been developed as a fetus, and that in itself, it's also some of the science behind being a trans goddess, a trans person. And so we have the gender expression, right? And what does gender expression mean in comparison to gender identity, something we will further explore. But gender expression is about the way you look, your outward appearance, and the way people perceive you to be, which is very important, right? Oftentimes the way we're perceived to be is behind a lot of the hate and violence that we received and the body terrorism that we go through. And so we see a spectrum of masculine and feminine, but there's all sorts of, combinations. Again, this is, you could be gender neutral for all points and purposes. And so I think that it's important to keep that in mind because we will do our best to provide best practices, but like trans people come from all walks of life, and we should all be prepared to welcome and celebrate each other, no matter if folks identify as masculine trans people or feminine trans people. And so we will go more into that as we discuss dress code and internal processes within organizations. Then we have gender identity. And gender identity is different than gender expression because this is about how you feel. This does not mean that this is how people see you, right? This is not your outward appearance. This is you at night consulting with your pillow and understanding how you feel, and many times, right, crying because we're deprived from being living our most authentic lives and having that gender expression. And then sexual orientation, right? It's not just about liking men or women or bisexual. There's, an entire, combination of sexual orientation manifestations in the population, and that's also very important to have because we live in a world of hyper-labelism, and we want to determine everyone who they are, and that's just not helpful. So moving forward, we have the gender unicorn. The gender unicorn is a wonderful representation. We also have the gender gingerbread and whatnot, but I love unicorns and I love purple, and so I will go with this. The gender identity, expression, sex assigned at birth, physical attraction to, and emotional attraction to are all, exemplified in this infographic. And it shows us, right, like in terms of gender identity, are you female, woman, girl, like how do you feel? Are you male, boy, anything and everything in terms of multiple combinations. Gender expression, we talked about that. Sex assigned at birth, we talked about that. Physical attraction to and emotional attraction to. And there is a difference because some of us will take our work farther and talk about healthy relationships and how to avoid intimate partner violence and all sorts of interesting and very important topics that our communities need to hear about. And so who we're physically attracted to speaks to our physical responses and arousal, whereas emotional attraction is who do we really feel intimate to in building those connections and bonds. And oftentimes they're not congruent. And oftentimes, we're forced to believe that, oh, I'm attracted physically to men and therefore, or, people with penises that identify in the masculine spectrum, and therefore I must be intimately in a relationship with someone of those characteristics. No. And so moving forward, we have Hayden, who will give us a thorough understanding of the rapidly changing landscape, legal landscape.
That is an ambitious goal. Just once more, I just want to jump back to the two slides that we just looked at. The one on the gender spectrum. I know there are folks on this call that could teach all of us a PhD level course on this and do it every day. And I know that there are some folks who some of this might be new for. And so if you didn't catch and nuance every single piece of each of these concepts, for me, the big takeaway from this slide is that we grow up in a world where we are taught that our sex assigned at birth, that our gender expression, our gender identity, and our orientation are the same, that they are inextricably bound up with one another, that you are born and assigned male, you show up in a way that is rigidly and stereotypically masculine, as I happen to do, that your sense of self inside, you feel like a man, and you're attracted to women. The most important thing about this slide is that that each of those elements of identity are distinct. So the main takeaway from this slide is we're taught that they're linked, but they are separate and interrelated. And on the second slide, the big takeaway there is just the idea that it's not this gives a bit more nuance. So the last slide showed us identity on a binary. And this is basically telling us that male and female, masculine and feminine, they are not polar opposites. They are different identities. So just the big takeaways. So I'm going to go quickly over federal law, and I want to acknowledge that many of you have probably been following the news and know that there have been recent shifts as of last night. So I'm going to go over just a quick lay of the land so you have the context, and share with you our understanding of what yesterday's decision means. So at a high level, it has been a rapidly changing legal landscape. It has been trending positive for quite some time now. There's 19 states, including the District of Columbia, where we have explicit non-discrimination protections. We have 66% of Fortune 500 companies have implemented non-discrimination protections. 50% companies offer inclusive healthcare benefits. Hundreds of businesses have gender transition guidelines. And so we have been on in a strong trajectory towards increasing equality and equity under the law. Next slide. And our community faces tremendous discrimination. Discrimination against trans people and gender-expansive people is pervasive throughout social institutions and the workplace. Trans folks have twice the rate of unemployment as the general population, 47% adverse job outcomes, 50%, so half of our communities experience harassment, 90% report discrimination, and 26% have lost a job. I think what's not reflected on here is the huge swaths of folks in our community that never get a job, that sometimes look at issues like employment non-discrimination as that unicorn that Catalina referenced, because the idea of having protections for a job they never would have access to because they don't get past the door seems, like a privilege that they can't imagine. So this doesn't reflect so many of the folks that never even get the chance to go forward. So the thing that I want to flag for today is that while there is no federal law that explicitly prohibits discrimination against LGBT individuals, and that's something that not only does the general public and the LGBTQ community not know, but when you tell most people, they don't believe you. They simply can't, poll after poll says, they simply can't believe that this is not already the law. So the good news has been that there has been a series of federal court decisions that have established that sex stereotypes is considered a form of sex discrimination prohibited by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VII protects job discrimination based on race, class, color, religion, national origin. Applies to federal employees, state and local employers, and private employers with 15 or more employees. Now, I think many of you have probably read the headlines, and just to give you the update, and if folks have more questions on this, we can get into it afterwards, but just so people know what it means. Yesterday, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education formally rescinded guidance that was issued just last year that outlined public schools' responsibilities to trans students under Title IX. What's important to know about this is the revocation of that guidance does not undo legal protections for trans students. Trans students are still protected by the Constitution, by Title IX's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sex, and that includes when they're using the restroom. And so we'll have much more, I'm sure, discussion about this as things unfold, but just so folks are clear on just what that meant, I know it's in your news feeds and in the newspaper. So I just wanted to give folks a quick update on what that means. So we're now going to talk a little bit about the intersections that Catalina referred to earlier in our discussion and how those different pieces connect. And so in the largest survey of trans-identified individuals, almost 30% of folks live in poverty. They experience unemployment at 3 times the rate of the general public, and 30% of respondents have experienced homelessness. And so I think it's clear that all of those pieces work together to make folks more vulnerable and to have less access to basic and crucial services like healthcare. The way that plays out for folks, the trans communities is, and this is just to the best of our knowledge, these are folks that we've gotten the information on, over half of folks who sought coverage for transition-related surgery were denied. A quarter that sought access to hormones were denied. 40% attempted suicide in their lifetime. 40% of trans folks, almost half of folks in our communities have attempted suicide. And respondents living with HIV at nearly 5 times the rate of the general U.S. population. Now, we know that HIV rates are much higher among transgender women than in the general population, and especially transgender women of color. One of our challenges around really deeply understanding HIV in our communities is that data is not collected in a way in which folks are allowed to identify as their full selves. So for many, many years, trans women were just slotted in under gay men. There have been some changes in that, and we're getting some better data. The 2 things that I'll flag is that the rates of HIV around trans men, transmasculine people, and gender non-binary or gender expansive people is truly an unknown. And it's an unknown that we are very concerned about. And so I say that to say, know that the little bit of data that we have tells us that trans women, and especially trans women of color, have incredibly high HIV and AIDS rates, but also know that trans men, transmasculine folks, and genderqueer folks they're not even at the table, which is to say we need to be thoughtful about all the different parts of our communities.
And something to, yes, absolutely. And something to keep in mind is that there's really hasn't been a push for like actual governmental research to put our taxpaying dollars into further understanding the realities that folks are living. A lot of underreported, a lot of underfunded realities lead to us not having accurate numbers for most of the LGBTQIA population.
There has been some progress with the CDC and NIH on trans women, but we still need to see that progress in other communities. Some of the best practices that we'll talk about shortly will lay out how all of you can help us with those crucial issues. So all of that sounds, it's very theoretical. There's a lot of numbers and a lot of concepts, and I think numbers and concepts are important. But at the end of the day, what has deepened my understanding of folks that are different than me and to help me understand with nuance and the ability to really be an ally is knowing someone's story and understanding how that plays out in our lives. And so we've invited a friend and a colleague and a leader here in DC, Achim. Achim is a Black trans man. He is a brilliant and well-respected leader in our community. He's very humble, so I hope he's going to share his story with you. But Achim, I'm so glad that you're here. Would you share just a little bit, as you've shared with me, about what your experience has been?
A little about myself is that November the 10th, 2011, I was diagnosed with HIV. And to me, that was very devastating as far as because I did whatever I had to do to stay negative for the most of my life. I'm a 46-year-old trans man, and in the year 2011, I was 40 years old. So imagine that you're finding out that you are positive at that point in time. And another thing was that I was in D.C. the only one, the only trans man who was documented as having HIV. So to me, that was the even scarier part. What helped me out was the provider that I went to. They have a red carpet program, which will, like anybody who is newly diagnosed, you are, getting access to having medical care, having a practitioner, HIV nurse. And they had like different groups there, like support groups that helped me out along the way as well. And another one, I had a nurse who went above and beyond. She called me on her days off, which she didn't have to do. She called me every day to check up on me because at that time, I was really into my transition, and the provider that I go to was very helpful with. But to imagine you're transitioning and then you're diagnosed with HIV due to sexual assault. And another thing, and being feeling like you're the only trans man who is at that given time that has HIV. If it wasn't for them, I don't think that I would be alive today because I was also suicidal. So with her calling me every day and the provider just being there for me, guiding me there, having the support groups, the staff just checking in on me, making sure that I'm okay, that was a positive for me. Another positive for me was there were like different retreats that I went to with another provider, which let me know able to learn about HIV. And a negative that I have is that when I apply for my ADAP every year, it's now that instead of every year I have to apply, it's every 6 months. And I don't find out that I have to apply until I go to my provider, which I feel as though there should be something better, like a reminder or something that will tell me that, look, you need to apply for your ADAP so that you can get your medicine, because that is stressful for somebody who is HIV positive. And stress also kills T cells. So that is not only messing with my mental health, that's messing with my physical health. I just think I think that everybody who's on the call that is a provider, that if someone is newly diagnosed, they should be checked on. They should be put in programs like the red carpet, where they are able to access different support groups. Oh, they're telling me I have 1 more minute, so I'm going to wrap it up. But I just feel as though that everybody has to go above and beyond more so what their job requirement is. Because if you're trying to grab a hold of this HIV epidemic, then that is one way to do it, and to make sure that everybody stays on their medication, because everybody knows as long as you're treated, you're able to be a productive entity in today's society.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very powerful, and I think it's incredibly helpful. You know, the two sort of high-level things that I heard there, and if your phone's not on mute, be good to put your phone on mute. But the two powerful things that I heard was, one, just the difference that an individual makes, the difference that nurse that called to check up on you, that provider taking that extra step of reminding you. I mean, it sounds like that really made a dramatic difference, and, you know, as you've shared, it's helped change your life. And the other was, you know, data collection, although I think this crew is pretty into it. Data collection can seem like a very dry and boring situation, but to me, living in Washington, D.C., which has one of the largest trans communities in the country, has a high rate of folks living with HIV, the fact that the Department of Health, when Achim walked through those doors, he was the only person that they knew of living with HIV is frightening to me, and such a demoralizing experience, and something that we can do something about, and that folks on this call can do something about by collecting data in a way that is inclusive and affirming. So, Achim, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I know folks may have questions for you, which we'll answer after. So we've talked a lot about the struggle. We've talked a lot about the things that we are dealing with and that need to get better. We're going to spend the next bit of time on our webinar together talking about is therefore what we can do about it. I'm going to go over 3 quick guiding principles for folks to bear in mind. We'll then hear some case studies, and we'll talk through some very specific best practices. Here are the 3 quick principles. 1, it's a journey. We're all on the journey. None of us are where we need to be. We're going to learn along the way. We're going to make mistakes, and that is just the process. It's like trauma. The only way is through. And so all of us are on a journey. The second is to listen and allow trans folks to lead. And that brings me to the third, which is ground it in your own experience. And so when we thought about what was the most important framework that we felt confident many folks on this call may have been part of help crafting and certainly are familiar, is the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. So we have this quote here: people cannot achieve their fullest health potential unless they are able to take control of those things which determine their health. And everyone on this call, I'm sure, knows, many of you were a part of it, was there was a time when the HIV epidemic was sweeping this country, when the people that were making decisions about HIV, about care, about folks' lives were not folks that were living with HIV, were generally not connected to the community, and the consequences were disastrous. And so people living with HIV and AIDS came together and they created this framework. And, you know, what meaningful engagement framework helps us understand is it is helpful at the individual level. It helps increase self-esteem. It helps create opportunities for involvement and leadership. It's helpful at the organizational level by not just changing norms and changing opinions, but because the people that are closest to a challenge are best equipped to find the solutions to those challenges. And in the community, we know that it changes hearts and minds. And so some things to think about, again, just from a framework perspective, just like we do in our work, establishing common ground with other organizations and networks of folks living with HIV and demanding a place at the decision-making table, making sure these principles are lived and practiced on an everyday basis, and encouraging professionals, particularly folks living with HIV, to become involved by offering their skills and services to organizations and networks of folks living with HIV. And so we share that to say, though that same framework, those same concepts, that idea of how do we want to be treated when we move through the world in an issue that we are directly impacted by, applying that same framework to the question of how to meaningfully engage trans folks is a great guiding principle. So we're now going to move from the general to the specific, and so one of my my three suggestions on approaching this work is to remember that we're all on a journey. The good news is that we're all at different places in the journey, and so we can learn from one another. Whitman Walker is the place that I went to when I first came out as trans, and has done just some incredible work. Amy Nelson, I'm so pleased, is joining us. She directs their legal program. She's going to chat with us a little bit about their journey and a little bit about what they learned. And so maybe you can learn them now instead of through the painful but powerful process that Whitman Walker went through. So, Amy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Hayden. I appreciate that introduction. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the call. Thanks for your interest in improving your services to the trans communities that Catalina so expertly described for us earlier. So the first thing I want to mention is that the most important thing is to create a welcoming environment, a welcoming place for your trans community. And so I'm going to talk about how you can do that and how you can make sure clients are treated with the utmost respect. So the first thing I would, let's see. Okay. So the first thing I want to share is the notion that you should always be asking questions, right? So Whitman Walker Health is proud to consider itself a learning environment. We certainly recognize that cultural humility is a process and not a goal, and that we're always working to get closer to that. So engaging clients both on-site and in the community and fostering open and honest communication is the way to move down that path of cultural humility. And so when I talk about engaging clients both on-site and in the community, I'm thinking about what we do in the D.C. area. We connect to our community through events like health fairs, Trans Pride, Trans Day of Remembrance. We here in the Legal Services program offer a series of Know Your Rights workshops for both trans and cis legal clients related to all sorts of things, stemming from immigration rights to public benefits, to access to health care, to HIV management. And then we also offer a lot of training opportunities to other social service providers, and also we train a lot of pro bono attorney volunteers. And so for those folks, we offer Trans 101 talk, similar to what we're going over today, and we also talk to those folks about the discriminatory practices facing, the most predominant practices facing trans clients around health care and employment. So engaging your cis allies who may not be directly involved in your same line of service is a good way to help spread education. Another thing you can do to connect with clients, of course, is to hire staff from your community. Here in the legal department, we have 2 trans-identified attorneys, and I'm thrilled that they're a part of our team, because when we go out in the community and give these trainings and talks, we're speaking from the heart, and our staff knows exactly what they're talking about. The last bit on that is just to encourage an open and honest communication and remind people that there's no stupid question, and ideally you can build a place of safety where folks are free to ask questions, much like today. So hopefully you'll take advantage of that window on the screen. And then specifically, I wanted to talk about some of the written protocols I would suggest for anyone working with trans clients. And so I have 4 points here. The first is just to establish written protocols related to your intake questions and your gender fields, both on your written forms and in any phone call outreach you do. In terms of fields you want to gather data on, Hayden mentioned that gathering both sex assigned at birth and gender identity and preferred pronouns are worthwhile fields. In terms of practically respecting clients, we also ask folks for their legal name and or their prior name. Obviously, a lot of clients come to us having already changed their name. We also make sure we have a field for the preferred name so that that is the leading label on all of our files, both electronic and written. And just to touch on that quickly, there's a lot of different file management systems that folks use both online and in hard copy. We have found internally that some databases we work with are more malleable, and others come with more rigid requirements and are more difficult to update the fields. And so, for example, in our medical record, the field choices for names, the number of fields is limited to 1, and so we put the client's preferred name in all caps. And so with that first name being in all caps, it's obvious to the person who's receiving that client either in person or on the phone how they should address that client. And then, of course, there's some other practical trainings that we offer our own staff on a continuing basis, those sort of beginner and sort of advanced trainings, all of which are mandatory for all staff, around some of the gender norms that we're all indoctrinated in. Obviously, lots of folks use sir and ma'am because they've been raised to use those polite signals, and we try to discourage staff from using those words. We also remind people that making assumptions about a client's gender identity or pronoun preference based on their physical appearance is a mistake, and it's always best to just ask folks up front what their preferred pronoun is. Particularly in our setting, in a healthcare setting, and in a legal setting here, we get a lot of clients who come to us straight from work or school or the military, and they may not be out in that setting, and so they may show up at our door presenting in a very traditionally masculine or feminine role, but the last thing they want to do is be addressed as incorrectly as sir or ma'am when they walk in the door because they're here hoping to receive more competent services. So I'll wrap it up there, and I look forward to answering any questions you all may have at the end.
That's great. We're going to actually go to Ariana next because I know Ariana fit us into quite a packed schedule. So we're going to want to just hear from her, and then we'll pause for questions. And Ariana, if you could stay, wonderful, and if not, we understand.
Hello, hello. Hello, how are you doing? My name is Ariana Lean. I am the CEO, also founder for Ariana Center, where is a trans-focused organization led by transgender people of color like myself, living with HIV, and I made from the HIV a career. Many of them, of my sisters, they working or they help me in the organization. They are transgender. Also, they are living with HIV or they are negative in PrEPs, and they face. And there is a I serving my my services to a community untouched by the regular outreach programs. Right? I give services to the most marginalized community lives, girls' faces, sex work, undocumented, and live the yellow incarceration. And for me, I think it's very important, and I just heard the first presentation when Catalina about and others about gender identity and sexual orientation, and when I'm starting the field, I don't know nothing about transgender myself. I just know I am a woman, and that's it. But many of these webinars, what I hear, when I listen, when I was part, like from 2007 to now, they made me understand what is the transgender community. Maybe because I am a transgender, but many of us, you already know what is everything about transgender community. So I think we have to educate how we can. Trans people living with HIV, they can get in undetectable viral loss. I have a case manager implemented for transgender individual. That is not like regular case manager program when they have like 40 or 45 clients and you low case, right? But my program, they have to management 15 to 20. But in 9 months to a year, the case manager have to make sure that transgender coming undetectable. And undetectable, and the transgender receive a correct case manager, and the correct case manager is through education, to PL box, to what medication is correct. I'm so happy when I go to AHF office over here in Fort Lauderdale, or Care Resources, or any of the providers around in Fort Lauderdale, and I talking with the provider and say, this medication, they cannot be for my client, because that client, this medication, you have to eat 800 calories for that, and she don't have money to eat. Or this medication have to take in the morning when the client finish her job at 5 a.m. in the morning, so have to skip. So, or what medication is best for the transgender. When I go in deep, behind the client, we're going to the histories of the client. And I think that is very important to everybody keeping in mind. And how is the correct linkage in care, right? How the program, they can be more attractive for transgender. When I hear many of the agencies, when I'm being around in my whole professional time frame, I hear, Calara, we have a program for transgender, but we don't have transgender. We're fine. They don't have transgender employers. If they have transgender employers, they want to hire only in the low levels salaries or situations, peer outreach, something. If the client, if the employer, they show and prove more. People, they want to take advantage of they don't have they cannot have going up and have supervising positions or different things just because it's transgender, and that's what I pass, and how we can be more attractive for the clients coming to your clinics, when you're going to be in your clinics and the clients ask for hormones and the doctor says not prepared, or they are not feel comfortable to prescribe hormones. This time, I'm the HIV field. I'm like a professional transgender individual working in the HIV. One doctor working in the HIV who is not feel comfortable and prescribe hormones to the transgender community don't have to be in the field, in the HIV field. They have to, each clinic has to be allowed to open a space for a transgender individual and their community and how they live, how they talk. It's very important. An example, in my situation, my agency is located in Fort Lauderdale, when the stigma is big issue for people living with the HIV. I'm the only transgender in South Florida coming out like positive, because maybe other girls, they want to work, but the stigma is hard. So how you can work with the stigma when your clinics, they only provide HIV services? But you can, my case manager program is included need change. When the need change, you can do a need assessment. When the need assessment, you can refer it to a client to different programs or resources. When the need assessment, you can refer it to the correct to the correct doctor. So I think they have to open more spaces and feel more comfortable for transgender individuals around to the country, and let transgender-led agencies working, but like always I say, is learning together. It's an experience of learning together. I right now at this time of my life, I feel very grateful. I used to be working in the health department in Orlando, Area 7. They teach me and they give me all what I know. I'm very happy when I have my managers in those programs. They let me be freedom for the transgender community. They made me work with the transgender community, and they educate me, and and people, they say, oh, how you can have indetectable people like 9 or 11 months, and my answer is very easy. When you work in HIV clinic and you have HIV person coming from the federal prison, the 99% of the federal prison clients are coming out. They coming indetectable because they take the medication at time, and that is what they have to do out of the jail for my community. That's what I hold and pick it up medication for ADAP. My name is in ADAP papers to go to pick it up medication. Yes.
Ariana, there's so much wisdom there, and I know you have so much more to share.
I just want to finish with five little points to educate yourself like you're doing now. We don't expect you to be perfect, but mainly you can make the investment, right? The second one is building relations with people who are credible leaders in the community with experience and these issues, and not just random trans persons, because maybe you can have a more problems or more issues later. Invest in building real relationship with trans-led organization, invite trans-led and trans people into the process, compensate for them for the time. And my 5 points, don't give it up. Thank you so much from my beautiful Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with 77 degrees.
Thank you so much. Those are a great 5-point list, and you have so much brilliance and wisdom to share. We appreciate your time, and just reminding folks that they can post their questions. But now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, best practices for trans-affirming organizations and businesses.
All right, everybody. I think that this is the meat and bones in many ways, and I would like to start by providing some pointers in best practices, because as you can hear, like, we all come to this work very differently, and the way I personally, Catalina, see some of the things, there needs to be some clarity. And just to be sure that we're on the same page, it's not preferred pronouns. They're mandatory. You're not doing us any favors. And trans is a prefix. So transportation is a word that derives from the prefix trans. Transgender is a different word. And so abbreviations could also be offensive. So always ask. That's not a rigid rule, but like that's something that should be in folks' minds. And then transgendered should be accompanied by a word like individual, like Ariana used, or transgender woman, transgender men, transgender people. Transgender by itself is just a descriptor, but not the subject. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Going into best practices for trans-affirming organizations and businesses, we would like to start with the employment non-discrimination and equal opportunity organizational HR policies. And I say this understanding that there are some states and localities that provide governmental protections. It's still a best practice to have your own organizational non-discrimination and equal opportunity policies written. And this is where those vocabulary concepts that we reviewed at the beginning come extremely handy, because when we are developing this non-discrimination equal opportunity policies at the HR level, we want to make sure that it's not just gender identity and alone, but also accompanied by expression. And I say this because there is gender nonconforming folks, and I have seen a lot of policing people's different jobs, right? This goes to the drag queen community or drag community. This goes to the cross-dressing communities because they are part of the trans umbrella terms and they need to be protected. And so a gender identity alone does not provide legal or organizational protections for employees that choose to live their most authentic lives and express their genders differently. So prohibiting discrimination, harassment in your employment opportunity policy should be accompanied by a document. So we ensure that folks know that this will be enforced, that this is something the organization cares about, and whatnot. If you have any questions, once again, feel free to post on the Q&A, and we will make sure to address them by the end. Moving to the next slide, we have medical benefits, right? And this is something that oftentimes folks need to keep in mind as they negotiate as senior leadership of nonprofits with the insurance company. So a great conversation starter is to ask, are certain procedures covered? And how do you interpret those procedures? Are they medically necessary or are they cosmetic? And it's important on how the insurance or the insurance policy you have purchased for your own organization interprets that, because it's part of living your values, but it will be, it could go from like extending hormone, gender-affirming healthcare to, gender-affirming surgeries, right, of all sorts. And I think that if it says it's cosmetic, you should also ask about, well, what's the process of proving it's medically necessary? Because it's not that black and white. Sometimes they will say it's a cosmetic procedure, but if we get, a gender dysphoria diagnosis or a letter from the physician explaining how medically necessary this is, and we will open for review. I recommend a medically necessary definition, like labeling of gender-affirming healthcare. If not, be very clear to outline the process and be ready to have a legal team to argue that, or partner up with an organization, a community organization like Whitman Walker, who has a wonderful legal team to advocate. So I'm going myself through some of these procedures, and my insurance currently sees it as cosmetic, but Whitman Walker has helped me prove that it's medically necessary. And so I say that because it's a process, and I most likely will have to appeal in case it's denied. And all of that requires resources, and there's that intentionality behind that. Hormones and transition-related surgeries required for gender-affirming maybe have to be included by employees, and we will build more on that. But some of the, Hayden, you have a comment. Go ahead. Oh, okay. And so there are some resources, and we'll make sure that those are passed along. Just so everyone's clear, there's a WPATH guidelines, and that will help you look at some of the medical standards as you are having these conversations with your own insurance providers.
Great. Yeah, medicine is, or healthcare is a little bit complicated because it varies depending on your state. The questions that I would ask are, am I in a state that has a bulletin, which is a regulatory guideline that ensures that any private plan that's offered is trans-inclusive? So the first question is, am I in a state that has such a requirement? If you are, well, that's some good news, because there's a good chance that your plan is inclusive. If you're not, then the work is to identify whether your plan has an explicit trans exclusion or if it is implied. And there are some resources we can direct you to in terms of making sense of that. The last thing I'd say on the insurance piece is, even when we have benefits in great insurance, one of the things that employees run into all the time is the insurance company denies them anyway. And so a best practice or thing to keep in mind is if you have a larger organization, to identify somebody within your benefits department to run point on that, to be a resource. If you have a smaller organization, to work out a way either with the insurance company or with a community partner so that you can help folks navigate that. So name change and gender markers, I'm going to go over this real quick. Here's what's important. The best practices as an employer and as a community-facing provider is the same, which is that this is irrespective of a legal name change. The point here is the best practice is whether or not somebody has formally had their name changed through the legal channels, is that the employer and the provider has tremendous discretion over almost every single piece of documentation in terms of how people are referred to. So there are very few cases and very few documents. Taxes are an example, pensions, there are some security issues where the legal name must be used, but employers, providers, largely it is complete within your discretion. So the work is to figure out what's a system that's going to work with my organization so that we can make sure to designate that in any public-facing document, name badges, lockers, and in terms of dealing with providers and clients, how do we designate that in our system? Whitman Walker gave a great example of a way to do that, which is they put the preferred name right at the top of the file. So then we have education for employees and clients. And so lead by example, using the proper names and pronouns in conversation, making it clear that transition, is just a part and parcel of the work that's happening, and it's not acceptable for that to be something that disrupts the workplace. Hosting a series of gender competency workshops that address HR best practices, organizational practices, and what constitutes harassment around trans people and gender expansive people in the context of the workplace. Here are the three, I think, most important things about this piece. One is to integrate some baseline language around trans issues into your standard compliance training, so it just becomes part of what you're doing. It's likely that having an additional cultural and technical competency training for your team, your volunteers, is helpful. If you can bring someone in from the outside, a strong recommendation is to bring a trans person who does this work to give these presentations. They're going back to sort of the concept of meaningful engagement, meaningful involvement. Trans folks living with HIV are going to be the best equipped to do this sort of training, and it's also going to help deepen relationships and connections. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is crucial. Outing someone that is trans can be a matter of life and death. And so it is really important that folks that are entrusted with this information before or if somebody doesn't make the decision to come out, treat that confidentially. A piece that's not on here, but I'll say quickly, is that a key best practice is having a written transition plan, a transition team, and to publicize it. And so figuring out if or when, and it happens more and more, friends, somebody on your staff comes out as trans, having a written policy and plan, a designated point person, and making sure that that point person and that plan is public information so they know where to go. If we have that in place, oftentimes we can do a great job with confidentiality and other crucial issues.
Wonderful. So let's talk about dress code. It's important for folks to understand that there's a real life experience mandate. What that means is that many folks who are transitioning at work, right, were required to provide or prior to surgery or medical assistance to assume the role for our new gender. And so that new gender means that, and this process is called the real life experience mandate. And so part of the experience is dressing appropriately for the new gender role that you, not new, I don't like that word, but the gender role you're adopting. And so keep that in mind. Ideally, a best practice is you shouldn't have a dress code, but if you have to have a dress code and it's absolutely necessary, also keep in mind that the medical process takes time. There may be some elements of gradual transition in people's appearances, but for example, when we're piercing ears, the starter studs must be kept at least for 6 weeks, right? And even then, right, like it could close off. So like keep in mind that there's a lot of elements to dress codes that if you could avoid having a dress code, you should. If you have a dress code because your healthcare providers make sure that it's gender neutral and that people can work with it so it works with their gender. A worker who has not yet completed electrolysis may have visible facial hair. or other elements. Keep that in mind, because if you're policing people's ability to put lipstick, and lipstick should only be put in faces without facial hair because that's what gender normativity has taught us, then make sure that you are aware of that. And if there's no need for that, then which I struggle finding a need for it, then leave it alone. Let the person be who they are. Allow enough flexibility in the dress code to accommodate transitions from one gender to the other. And with regards to like a sample policy around dress code, here is what I can provide for all of you. A transitioning employee's attire should remain professionally appropriate to the office in which they work and the job they hold. The same dress codes and rules for behavior apply to all folks, regardless of gender, as to other employees. If as a manager you're concerned about the appearance of your transgender employee, will present when she or he or them or their starts coming to work in the other gender role, ask for a picture of them in professional attire. If you still have concerns, this should be addressed with your employee. If she, he, them addresses or dresses or behaves inappropriately, this issue should be dealt with the same way that any other issue should be dealt with. And I was trying to read contextually in this part because this is drafted language. Like, this needs to be codified in HR policy. Go ahead, Hayden.
Great. So I think just to pull some of those different pieces together, the key about having a transition policy, integrating trainings, having a dress code that makes sense is, even the best intended employees, if we don't and leadership team members, if we don't equip them with the knowledge and the skills of how to navigate these spaces, we'll make a mistake. And so the key is to really try to don't wait until you have someone that comes out as trans. Don't wait till you start to build up more trans clientele. Integrate this as part and parcel to what you do. I'm going to go through the others very quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. And so restroom access, here are the core pieces to know. The most important thing is that people should be allowed to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity and gender expression. Thing number one. Thing number two, it is a best practice to have gender-neutral restroom available in a public place. That sends a strong message to folks that are trans or gender expansive or gender nonconforming, and just is practically helpful. Here's the thing. If something that people misunderstand about this point is that it is the right of trans folks, and it is our job as employers to ensure that they have access to the restroom that lines up with their identity and their expression. If somebody is uncomfortable, then the other reason why it's good to have a gender-neutral restroom is that you can direct them there. But the answer is never to insist or direct the gender expansive or transgender person to that room. So meritable status and trans benefits, this is pretty straightforward. It's just that when somebody transitions, it does not automatically mean that they no longer have a legally binding relationship for a whole host of reasons, so don't make that assumption.
But that doesn't take away from having to adjust with the insurance to make sure that there's no assumptions that they are still married and that they are going to be beneficiaries of folks within that. And so that might require some HR support as well, even though the legal marriage doesn't get undermined.
That's a great point. On sick and personal days, the reality is that basic, necessary, crucial care for trans folks it may be different than what you've encountered or experienced before. And so these are just some rough guidelines, but making sure they have access to therapists, to doctor office visits, to electrolysis, laser hair, time up for surgery. There are some general principles there, but just understanding that that is a part of medically necessary care. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Catalina, do you want to do a 1-minute wrap-up before we open up?
Sure. So really quick, let's, on the sick and personal days, keep in mind that not everyone needs it, so they may, so speak on an individual case-by-case basis. Redefining success, this is the principle. We are not just the subjects of needing all of these things. We're experts of our realities. We're experts of who we are. And so redefining success requires that intentionality around what are some skills that that are necessary. And those skills could be informed by personal narratives and personal situations. So redefining those when you're creating a job description, redefining those when you are looking at attract talent is key, because otherwise you won't have folks celebrated and attracted to that. And moving from that, because we are on a crunch time, other considerations to keep in mind is train HR personnel, trans-affirming interviewing processes, background checks. Understand that, like, when you're running a background check, for me, for example, Catalina Velasquez, there's some things like my Georgetown degree that did not come with my Catalina Velasquez name, so make sure that you navigate that, understanding confidentiality and whatnot. Same thing applies when you are referencing checking. Make sure you work with the employee, the person, the candidate, as you do that. You shouldn't out folks on a reference call. You should let folks give heads up and deal with that prior. An explicit cross-dressing acceptance policy, right? This is why we want to have the gender expression elements in the employment non-discrimination, like HR policies, relocation options and support. Sometimes people just want to start with a clean slate, and if that's a possibility, make sure that you're flexible and allowed for that to take place. Moving forward, I think those are pretty much it. We want to have the questions section, and then we'll have further readings and some resources at the end.
So as we go to questions, I just want people to know that the presentation will be online at aidsunited.org/webinars. The other thing is that if we have more questions that we don't get to today, we will actually answer those questions and post them with the webinar. So one of the questions we have for you is there any data on the reason for the denial of surgery and hormones? Is it provider bias, economically driven, both, or something else?
That's great. I mean, the person answered their own question on the question. It is both, and it is, lack of legal protection and discrimination.
What about someone who identifies inside the gender binary, but the opposite of what they were assigned at birth? How would they then be referred?
So the question, I think, is if somebody was assigned female at birth, but they identify as male, what would they be? Is that right?
So I'm not going to try to interpret. I'm
All
going
right.
to read
Okay. Do it again.
I don't understand.
What about someone who identifies inside the gender binary, but the opposite of what they were assigned at birth?
That's a great question. So that person broadly would be construed as being transgender. So I know that we've talked a lot about gender non-binary folks, but I was assigned female at birth, but I identify as male, and I'm transgender. Our sort of larger point is there are also transgender people who do not identify on the binary spectrum.
Who refuse to adopt a trans identity or don't want to, or, I mean, ultimately this is up to the individual. And some trans women like to call themselves, and not just call themselves, identify as women, and that needs to be respected. So it's discretionary on an individual basis.
Do you have a written transition plan that you'd be willing to share? And I'm going to expand that into some of the other HR policies that you've mentioned, or that you could be willing to share that we could post?
So Parallax has a sample transition plan, and we're particularly proud of it because it's one of the only ones, it's the only one that we've ever found that includes gender expansive and gender non-binary people. And happy to share that. We do this work as trans consultants, and happy to work with folks after this. But if we get the list of options and resources that folks are looking for, we can share everything that we can. We're very invested in your success. And then, of course, lay out other options and working together.
Cody, can you flip to the next slide? There's resources there that people can. What are some strategies for introducing adding pronouns in email signatures?
I think it's like anything else that is new. So I think that the important thing is that your leadership team, your executive team, and if you have a board of directors, know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Number one. Number two, it's important to communicate that to your team and staff. So not just that we're doing it, but why we're doing it. A lot of times folks roll this out. People have no idea what's happening. It creates a ton of pushback and confusion, and we miss an opportunity to have a great conversation. And so talking about from a values perspective and also from a practical perspective of respecting folks for who they are and the rationale behind it, making sure leadership is bought in. And it used to be, these things are always changing, but 3 or 5 years ago, the practice was preferred pronoun. The best practice today is just pronoun. And the feeling is that when you say preferred, it suggests a lack of realness or authenticity. And so it is, in fact, just the person's pronoun.
Is there any advice on being mispronounced by a superior, especially in a meeting or public setting?
If it, I think this is, I'm imagining that this is mispronounced or misgendered perhaps by a supervisor. Our recommendation, it's really about your comfort level and how you want to address it. You could address it right there in a direct and respectful manner. You could address it outside of the room. We'd say is if it happens once or twice, we're all on a journey. If it happens consistently and persistently, then they're open to a lawsuit, and that has been construed as harassment and is illegal.
So just one more that we have time for, and again, we will answer the other questions and we'll attach that onto the post. I have quite a few unemployed trans clients who want to have a job so they can secure their own housing. How do we leverage trans clients' strengths in the job search? My clients are very worried about bringing up their gender journey in an interview if they get there.
Yeah, that's a big question. Way to leave it for the end. I'd say, three quick things. One is to use if you're an organization that does advocacy, to use your strength and power to push policies at the local level that are targeted towards unemployed people, to include trans folks. Often municipalities have targeted programs for veterans, for the long-term unemployed, for people with a whole set of characteristics, all of which trans folks are disproportionately impacted by. And so one is to push for a program and for support. Two is to model the behavior that you're looking for, so hire trans people. And three is, a lot of what folks are doing are cultural competency trainings. Invite trans folks in to help you shape your cultural competency trainings and do that as a fee for service. And then the last is just sort of wraparound services, which is, Amy talked about this, Ariana talked about this, Asha talked about this, this idea of integrating legal needs, medical needs, and social service needs. And if you don't offer those services yourself, partner with an organization that does. So folks are also getting resume help. You keep a list of trans-inclusive employers, etc.
So, Hayden, I want to thank you and your team for a power-packed, information-filled, hopefully motivating, what was motivating for us at least, presentation and webinar. On your screen, you see in front of you some of our upcoming AIDS United opportunities. You see AIDS Watch, March 27th to 28th, our Succession Planning Institute, Sector Transformation Grant Funding, and our Pedro Zamora Public Policy Fellowship. Please visit our website for all of the details for all of those, and we hope that you join AIDS United in these different opportunities. Again, like I said, I want to thank you and your team, Hayden, for such a great presentation, and we look forward to being able to partner with the transgender communities.
Hey, real-time learning.
It can be taught. Transgender communities in a much deeper way to make sure that we're promoting transgender leadership, that we're promoting activities that are culturally, what's the word I want to
competent, appropriate, affirming. We are so honored to work with AIDS United
in a way that really makes sense.
An organization that truly is modeling, is walking the walk, right? And I've just been, so impressed and proud to work with folks that are open to critique, that are committed to change, that really have the real values and commitment. I think it's a model, and I think everyone on this call is a model for leadership. You just spent 90 minutes at a very, very busy time. Cody's signaling 92 minutes, so I have to be quiet. But so grateful for your leadership. This is how change happens. We'll try to be resources in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you.